In this video we're going to talk about using convention over code. You can see that my component now has two templates in it. The IDs have changed, so the ID says list template or grid template, and there's a dash in between. So what I want to be able to do is to go to where I use my component and then say data-display equals either list or grid, and depending on what is displayed here, we need to change a couple of things about the component. So you can see here that our UL, we've got the standard UL, but we also have it that it supports a grid. And so if we use list, then we need to revert this thing back to its original state. But if we say we want to use grid, then we want to add this grid class to it. Also, we want to be able to define which one of these templates we want to use. So the first thing that we can do here is just to go and read that value. So we want to go and get the data-attribute, get the template, and set the class. So let's first go and get the data-attribute. So we'll say const display is equal to this dot dataset dot display. Now, what if I didn't define the display? What if I didn't define this? I still want to either display list or grid, so there must be a logical default that it falls back onto, so that the user doesn't have to define this. So what's the default? Well, the default that we want to use is list. So instead of writing an if-else statement to deal with that, we can just add here or list. So what will happen is that if display comes back as undefined, it'll come back essentially as false, and then we can use that as a Boolean expression to say, well, if that isn't defined, then use list. So if it is defined, it'll use whatever value you send onto it, else it will use list. And this is a very easy and common way to deal with scenarios like that, so that you can actually prevent having to write if-else statements to do that. Now, added to that, we want to go and get the appropriate template. So we want to build up the key that we're going to use in our query selector to go and find the relevant template to use. So we'll say that the key is equal to, and we're going to use string templates for this. So it has that funny little quotation mark on there. And we want to put in a hash because we're going to be working with IDs. And now the fun part starts. So we want to say list dash template, right? But this thing could be either list or grid. So we will put in our placeholder and say here that we want to use the display that we've fetched at the top. So this is the query that we're going to use to go and fetch our thing. So we can say const template is equal to this dot query selector, and we can send our key in there, and now we have the relevant template. So let's do this. Say document dot write template dot children 0 dot outer HTML. Let's say instance is equal to template dot content dot clone node true, and then let's show that of the instance. Okay, so you can see that we have that li, empty li in here. I'll just put that breakpoint over there. And then if we go back to this now and we make this grid and save it, and we'll just quickly refresh this guy, then we can see that our instances HTML is now the grid one. So convention over code here is what we use to go and fetch the right items. So the last thing we need to do is still add the classes. So what we can do here now is to say if the list.dataset.display is equal to grid, then we want to set the UL to grid. So we can say this dot query selector UL dot class list dot add grid. So when we want to add a class to element, so let's take an example. I'm going to say this one has a class of blue. The way that I would do this in JavaScript is to go and use the class list object that is on that element and add the class grid. So the reverse of this would be to go and remove it, right? So we'll take that and just say class list dot remove grid. So now it'll take grid out of the class list. But obviously, we don't want to repeat the fetching of that item the whole time. So it's probably just a good idea to go and take this item and cache it. Because in the next video we're going to be looking at adding more content to this item, and then we'll worry about it. But for the sake of this video, let's just quickly summarize what we did. First of all, we have a data-display that we want to display either a list or a grid. Then in my HTML, I'm using a convention for the component to say I've got two different templates, one for list and one for grid, and that the ID of this item is consistent, whereby the first item before the dash equals the data dash attribute that I'm sending on, and then dash and the word template. So in my component, it becomes really easy for me to then go and determine what item I want to go and fetch. So step one is to go and get the key, but if we don't define a data dash display, we default it to list. So this will prevent us from having bugs where somebody forgot to actually define it. Then we go and define the template that we want to use. This is essentially the query that we're going to use in the query selector. So we're using string templates for this. Use a hash in the front because it's an ID. Then the string placeholder to say this is where I want you to put the display value in, and then the word template. So the key will either be hash list dash template or hash grid dash template, and then we go and fetch the template and we clone it, and that's how we get instances based on convention over code. And then the last bit is just to say we need to change the class CSS class on the UL component, and so we do that by using the class list and saying either add for me a class or remove for me a class.